welcome to the CNBC Africa Exchange alongside WEF Africa. I'm Nozi Pombanjwa, and I'm sitting down with best-selling author, Singularity University faculty member, faculty of Duke CE, global speaker, trend specialist, and also GQ's most influential and connected man. This is, of course, John Sanei. John, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the list of things that you have done is fast running off my page. But if I were to sort of pull them together, you're converging human psychology, business strategy, and future studies, and you're challenging people to think about the extent to which they're future ready. Just tell us a little bit about the back end of your work and how did you come to these three particular strands as the focus of what you do today?
For the longest time, I've been fascinated with the future. And I've been researching the topic and sharing it with audiences. And with much excitement, the audience would listen to everything, and it was so much buzz. And I'd go back 6 months later, and absolutely nothing had changed inside that business that I'd worked with. And then I decided that I needed to bring in a bit of business strategy, because obviously just understanding the future wasn't good enough. And then we need to understand, how do we apply it? So I combined business strategy and future studies and went, and again, had a fantastic response, went back 6 months later, and nothing had changed. And then I started realizing that actually human psychology was what was stopping people from building the courage and clarity to make the changes required for the future we're moving into. And so I started researching psychology and realized that actually what is holding us back is our inability to let go of our past.
Right.
And that combination of explaining the future in a categorized, contextualized story format that doesn't make it scary, business strategy to help us understand how we need to apply it, and the psychology of the individuals required to actually build the courage to practice that.
And that's because the future, I can understand, that is usually framed fearfully. And so you have those human psychological pushbacks because we don't want to run towards the things that we fear the most. So how does one and a business and at a personal level break through some of those psychological pushbacks and actually really begin to think about whether they're future ready or not?
So organizations are made up of people. So I'm just going to talk about people, because once we get the people right, the organization is just a reflection point of that. The number one thing that I've realized is that people are stuck in their memories. And what has happened is that if we don't heal our past in our individual capacity, then what happens is that the more familiar our past is, the more predictable our future becomes. And so what we are all trying to do is recreate our past into the future and then get upset that the future doesn't look like the past, but the future isn't going to be the past. And so we have to let go of our past. That's the first thing, is actually to create wisdom within our psyche. What we need to do is heal all the trigger points, all the pain points that come from our past.
What does that practically look like, John? I mean, I think it sounds almost poetic, you know, to go back and heal some of those trigger points. But if you practically go on this journey and you begin to confront those memories and those pain points, and you want to make sure that you're future ready, what does the journey look like in terms of really beginning to deal with some of these pain points?
The first thing is you must realize that you're in a holding pattern. As a human being, your psychology is based on a set of memories. Your memories have now been proven that are 50% wrong. They've just subjective stories that you've held on to. That's step one. Understand that you're in a holding pattern. Understand that what you're going through is based on where you come from, not where you're going. In my second book, I have a line that says, are you running away from the darkness, or are you running towards the light? And most people are running away from something based on this anxiousness that's created by trying to recreate tomorrow into the past. So first, become aware that you're in the pattern holding system. 2, realize that there's coaches, workshops, and books that are focused totally on healing our past. And engage with these teachers and engage with these thought leaders. Tony Robbins, for example, says, we have to move away from unconscious memories to conscious memories. In other words, we must stop blaming our past and we must start thanking our past. One of them hooks us in with anxiousness, resentment, and anger, and the other one energizes us, releases us with forgiveness. And so this, you can say it sounds pretty like airy-fairy, but actually the future requires us to be adaptable and not linear. It requires us to be flexible and not stuck. And so the whole of our economic situation and all of our structures in society are based on the Industrial Revolution that's about 100 odd years old, really, in the Western world. I mean, it started in the 1700s, but really got grip from the 1900s. And so education has told us to think linearly forever,
Yeah.
not adaptability. And so really wisdom is the number one thing that releases you from your past in order that you can become adaptable.
But it sounds like it comes down to perception and the choice of what you choose to see and the choice of the meaning that you choose to give to a particular incident, a particular event, or a particular moment in time. And the muscle of perception can be a very difficult muscle to build when we find comfort in one lens. How do you begin to make sure that you are conscious of the perception that you're bringing to any given moment?
Well, I think it's just being conscious. I think most people aren't even conscious that they run with a perspective.
Yeah.
And I think they've become so used to having to complain and moan about things just aren't working out. And what really starts to happen is that you start sticking around with other people that moan and complain about the same things you do.
Echo chambers.
It's echo chambers. So for me, firstly, can you become aware whether you're living in hindsight, plain sight, insight, or foresight? And this is really what my book's about, is hindsight is living in your memories. That's not going to work. Plain sight is just realizing for the very first time that seeing is believing. It's not true anymore. Believing is seeing is true. We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. You know, when you wanted to buy a new car, all of a sudden you started seeing that car everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, BMW wasn't inside your head
Not
and then
that
started
car.
plotting. Well, any car, Ferrari, let's whatever, for you, Ferrari. But they weren't plotting it and understanding where it was. We create that.
Yes.
And, you know, you understand that.
Yeah.
So if you're suffering from plain sight, you're not understanding quantum science and you're not understanding the latest research. But I think the most dangerous thing we have in the world today is people that are stuck in insight. And people that are stuck with insight are the ones that are incredibly well versed in educational sort of literature.
Yes.
They have the MBAs, the PhDs, the doctorates, and they're actually called the expert problem. And the expert problem means that the more you've been taught to think in a certain way, you can't accept anything that comes outside of the way you think. And so in other words, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
And so we've got to realize that if you're living in hindsight, plain sight, insight, your perspective is not allowing you to prepare for the future.
How do consulting businesses, for example, and I won't use names, but some of the big consulting businesses in the world where the entire business model is based on the idea that our biggest capability is to produce insight and to think in a particular way and to build a particular framework and a structure in ways that we engage with problems. How do they begin to engage with a message like this to say, actually, you're just really, really, really good at problematizing the problem?
Well, I think insight was enough. I think their business structures are from the old era.
Yeah.
And I think extrapolating the past into the future was something that worked very well. That's why most of our CEOs are CAs, because that was the skill that was required. And I think those models are crumbling. Those business models are folding. And all these consultancies are actually multi-dimensional businesses now. They're buying into other sectors because they're realizing this isn't really one thing that's going to take them into the future. And so foresight requires us to create curiosity and wisdom. And it's these two characteristics that we've not allowed to be had because education never let us be curious. Education was forcing us to be linear in our thinking. Wisdom was never something leaders spoke about. It was just, you know, if you've got an MBA or you're a CA, okay, come in. But really the wisdom and curiosity that we as humans inherently need in order to be able to move to the forward, into the future, is something that we need to start focusing on. And this is why I'm writing books and talking.
So without giving away the contents of the book, FOREsight, which I know that has been really making the rounds around social media. People love the cover. They're putting it across their face and sort of halving their face in the cover of the book. At a high level, what are the big takeaways, big messages that you're sharing through this particular book that helps people to move towards foresight and living in that particular realm?
We have a society that's perpetually anxious. And it's become the default button for people to be anxious. That's why we joke about wine o'clock on a Wednesday morning at 9:22 a.m. And that's because people are alcoholics and because they're so anxious about things that are happening. And so how do we go about really understanding that we're in a transition phase between two different types of societies? These two different types of societies is changing the very essence of value and how we bring about value into the world and what value comes back to us. Pretty much exactly the same thing that happened between the agricultural time and the industrial times. The very essence of value changed. And so we're in that space right now, except things are going at hyper speed. And so the very essence of value, for example, of communication has now become free. And so that has all of a sudden happened over the last 5 years or so. And we're going to many things start becoming free. And so what I'm trying to get people to firstly understand is that it doesn't require you to be innovative in this future, because innovation just says doing what you did yesterday a bit better.
Yeah.
What we need to start realizing is that the whole paradigm of business is changing. The whole concept of success has to be redesigned. Mm-hmm. And if you just think about the digital nomads of the world today that are moving around the world with a backpack and one suitcase, their idea of success is very different to the last generation of working 40 years in one company and then retiring.
And getting a gold watch at the end of it.
And getting a gold watch. And so what we've got to realize is that this is not a technological revolution. It's a societal revolution. Mm-hmm. And in this society that we're shifting, we have to shift. Mm-hmm. We have to become different versions of ourselves in order to thrive, become naturally adaptive, because if we don't, we can't unlearn and relearn skills. And so we have to move away from economies of scale to economies of learning. Sure. And how quickly can you unlearn and relearn your new skill set? And how quickly can you unlearn and relearn what your consumer actually wants? And if we think things are going fast now, we've got to realize that in the future, you'll have to redesign your career every 2, 3, 4 years. And if you're not doing that, you aren't going to thrive.
Are you finding that in terms of the reception of the messaging, whether it's from FOREsight, whether it's from the talks that you're giving, whether it's from the workshops that you're running, that the younger generation are able to adopt this posture of agility far quicker and far easier than those that are a little bit older, or am I just being unfair?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think we mustn't generalize, because I don't think all young people are adaptable. But I think this new generation does see success in a very different way. And you also got to realize that innately human beings are always curious. And we've been drummed out of curiosity. So the older generation have not actually utilized that skill set. And so when I'm speaking to them about curiosity, it seems like I'm speaking Chinese to them. Because they're saying to me, well, I've got a job, I've got a mortgage, I've got a car. I don't have time to be passionate or curious about anything. But really what's happening is that most businesses are being commoditized. Most salary structures are starting to change in the way that they're being remunerated. And so people are panicked, and what they don't realize that the panic is self-induced, and you can actually unlearn a whole bunch of things that we've been taught in order to adapt and get ready.
So FOREsight is the third book,
yes,
if I'm correct. What's in the pipeline is the fourth?
It's called The Evolution of Value.
I didn't expect an answer to that. The evolution of value. So high level, what are we receiving?
There's 10 major topics that I think everybody wants to know about. Politics, economics, masculinity, femininity, religion, and a whole bunch of other major topics. And what I want to describe in the book is how they're evolving. I mean, if you just look at what's happening in South Africa at the moment, and the concept of the immature masculine creating such havoc around us, we have to start understanding, what does the evolution of masculinity look like? And how do we go about fulfilling a mature masculine framework within ourselves as men, and what do we need to do to get there? And if you look at feminism has also evolved. And what feminism was in the 80s and 90s can't be now. It's got to evolve, and the value has to change. I think the structure of politics is broken, and we can see that around the world. Governments aren't functioning like they're supposed to be functioning. And so people are stuck at loggerheads, working out their internal stuff, not worrying about the people. So the book is about how do we evolve ourselves to add more value to these 10 structures, and how do we take responsibility, the ability to respond rather than react to what's going on around us.
So that was going to be my last question, but I'm quite tempted as I wrap up this conversation. As a man looking at what is happening in South Africa in terms of the high reportage on gender-based violence, and how as a country we've been forced to think about what is it that we have embedded in young men, middle-aged men and old men, about their beliefs about women, and whether this is something we've taught them at home, taught them at schools, or whether we've taught them in the churches. How do we begin to undo some of those belief systems, and how do we get men to begin to reflect on how they're showing up and the role that they're actually playing in society? How have you reacted to the spate of reportage around gender-based violence?
Well, the first thing I did was on social media was take responsibility for the masculine mass consciousness. And I think as men across the world, we have had a very tough time in as far as never having a archetypical mature masculine show us the way. And so even in generations before, fathers were present but not emotionally available. They were never given celebratory points for being emotionally available. They were given celebratory points for putting food on the table and making sure that the kids weren't acting out. And so we just have had a lack of leadership and as far as men are concerned. And when somebody like Madiba arrives, who's the most perfect mature masculine, we are in adoration of him. And we don't realize that these things take time and effort. And what we need to do as men, firstly, is take responsibility. Even if we are not perpetuating that violence, we have to take responsibility for even making the smallest joke about something that's derogatory. And it's those small little rituals that become habits, behaviors, and personality of the masculine consciousness. And so for me is we're going to start running conferences around the country for men by men for us to start just unpacking the understanding of why we are unhappy, because men are unhappy and this is why they're doing these things. They're not happy in themselves. And so we have to take responsibility and the ability to respond based on a space of healing ourselves rather than coming from a reactive place. So it's a process. It's a process of unlearning, and it's a process of all taking us responsibility for what we're all doing as men.
John, thank you so much. There you have it, John Sanei talking to us about the blending and convergence of human psychology, business strategy, and how this all comes together for future readiness, but also weighing in on his own thoughts on what does it take and what will it take for us as a society to heal from the place that we are at. And this is, of course, looking at the lens and the role that men are playing in South Africa at a time when there's been a spike in gender-based violence. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Remember, we want to keep this conversation going with you, so follow us on Twitter. It's at CNBC Africa. The hashtags that we're using, CNBC Africa Exchange, rather, and of course, as well as WEFA 19. That's WEFA 19. Thank you so much for joining us.